Having studied the excellent work of Cain, Canelli and Stoico about the epistolary of Saint Jerome, in my PhD dissertation I suggested an alternative classification of his letters, following my own criteria, mainly based on a linguistic, narratological, stylistic and rhetoric analysis. I concluded that we can find 6 macro-categories: paranetic, elegiac, functional, polemic, exegetical, narrative letters. This last category is very new since I decided to consider the content and structure more than the addresses. My aim was to reveal and study their intimate kinship with the lives, written by the author more or less in the same period. Both of these masterpieces were the product of Jerome's need for communication, fictional vein, and aptitude towards storytelling, exploited to support a newborn peculiar monastic movement. In this way, I persuaded myself that letter 1 to 17, 22, 23, 41, 33, 68, 70, 72, 170, 130, despite being different from one another in length, addressee, and content, showed specific narrative techniques and strategies which were to be analyzed. Here I have to thank the organizer of Epistle Narrans conference in Tubinga, since my present research started on that occasion. Here what I presented are only some of the points of a larger work born there, and so cutting short many passages, I hope to be here enough. What makes them narrative letters is the behavior of the author. He is pleased to narrate episodes, places in Miss Desert and Sea, as we have seen now, memoirs, novels, or exemplars to his friends, trying to persuade them to embrace or persist to follow his monastic way of life. In doing this, it is always attractive and entertaining, thanks to peculiar narratological tools. For letters in particular, we can talk about weak narrativity, because they incorporate a proliferation of minor narrative genres: anecdotes, gossip, fantasy jokes, dream narrative, ekphrases of paintings. Nevertheless, the inner and extra-textual function of this episode changed throughout time, especially because letter writing is a form not only of representing but of constituting reality. So, following Cavalera's chronology, I have identified 3 main periods in Jerome's narrative production. In the desert, Jerome complains about his loneliness and lets the reader meet him as a hermit through letters that are at the same time factual and fictional, and through Vita Poli, the first step in shaping a new history of monasticism. In Rome, he especially addressed long paranetic letters about the lives of holy women to Marcella, building his influence and authoritativeness in the Western world and promoting himself against other competing groups. At the end of this period, he also writes Vita Malchi, turning his relationship with Paula into a breathtaking novel of chastity. In Bethlehem and later, he writes something that we can almost call meta-literature, explaining why he frequently uses polemical issues in these works. In the same period, he narrates the adventures of Saint Hilarion, enriching them with historical hints and revealing that the late antique world was changing and challenging new gauntlets. Before starting to analyze the internal narrativity of letters and lives, we firstly need to remember that, as the writing of letters in antiquity was strictly regulated, Jerome wasn't going to break the rules which he had studied and admired. At the same time, he was well aware that, to spread the new Christian message at its best, it was necessary to steal and regenerate classic tools, to use episodes, as Antoine would say, as a passepartout genre. In the same way, as I have elsewhere said, also the lives can be considered, quote informal, as a form of experimenting, not belonging to a definite genre. The blurring line of all these texts reflect Jerome's ambiguous personality, but are able to define the traits of the holy man Christian heroine in the letters and those of the holy man Christian hero in the lives. And in second place, Jerome as an authoritas. Epistle 1 to Innocence is very interesting for us, but necessarily I had to cut off many passages. It can be entitled History of a Martyrdom's Epic Fail, and it is a sort of ideal entanglement between epistles and lives. Actually, I would dare to say that having been written in 374, but the chronology is not sure I am adopting Agendahl's chronology, a few years before Vita Poli, it is the matrix for both of them. It derives its form from Acta Martyrum, a well-known and structured genre in ancient Christianity, aspiring after the end of persecutions. It is the report of a miracle which occurred at the time of Diocletian in Vercelli, the story of a woman who went 7 times by her persecutors and tortured to death, doesn't faint, lives and testifies the greatness of God. Since it is the supernatural story of a martyr, and the monk is exactly a failed martyr or a new type of it, for he loses his life in a metaphorical, not in a real way. For Jerome, the unnamed woman is the prototype of monks and nuns. For these reasons, we can ascertain that the text, although addressed to innocence is a sine qua non condition for letters, has less of the letter and more of the hagiography, if it's true. In particular, it has many features in common with Vita Malchi and this Lust am Fabulieren, literary quotation, the initial nautical metaphor, the rubigo, the unnamed female heroine, narrative mechanism, the claimant suicide, skin-taught, bloody details, witty trick to gain freedom, and a stylistic pattern that resembles that of a novel, an antagonist and the intervention of the marvelous and undesirable happy ending. This is what entertains the reader. Nevertheless, the letter tends to be a praise of Evagrius, a good friend of Jerome, who intervened in the persecution and prevented the woman's second death. That is what brings the reader back to reality, giving him the sensation that God is operating in history through the group to which Jerome belongs. Epistle 2 to Theodosius and other hermits is a very brief letter in which Jerome praises the desert. 2 motives are substantial: the drawing of the solitudo as a locus amenus, as we have seen, and the captatio benevolentiae toward the habit of the desert. Jerome here introduces himself as a sinful man needing forgiveness, using 2 main metaphors that will often return in his production, the one of the good shepherd and that of the prodigal son. They are a sort of professio humilitatis that resumes the saint's own biography and his experience in a desert scene at the very place of monasticism. The Christian themes intersect classical literature, and Jerome also uses a metaphor derived from Virgil, the ship which has a tormenting journey, the life, but still arrives safe at the harbor. All these literary expedients turn this letter into a propedeuticon, full of pictures and sketches about Jerome's everyday life that evoke narrative forms of coherence without fully submitting to them. Is narrated by himself. Closer to the attitude of the first letter and of the lives is Epistle 3 Trophinos. In this letter, Jerome compares himself to Bonosus, whose life is an incredible journey among the rocks of ascetic life, again the nautical metaphor, to gain his place on an island surrounded by cliffs, wild lands, and seas. On the contrary, a storm blows Jerome from Aquileia. We can consider this letter, written in 375, the third example of male hagiography of Bonosus seen as a poor Senex by the center of freedom, but it is also an account of Jerome's journey throughout the Mediterranean Sea, so the real element. closely connected to this last letter and its narrative construction of friendship and solitude are episode 8 to 13, in particular episode 7 to Chromatius, Zeus and Jovinus, where Bonosis is named Filius Ictus, and where desert and sea again are one more time compared, exactly as the sinful life of Jerome and the perfect lifestyle of his friend. But it seems that this holy paradigm is not sufficient to promote an exemplar way of life. Jerome has read Evagrius' translation of Vita Antoni and needs his own archetype, especially to convince Heliodorus after the failure of episode 14. Here I will be even more synthetic. In episode 5, explicit references to Vita Pauli and to the upcoming Vita Malchi appear. Here start to become apparent that all these fictional characters are Jerome's alter egos. Episode 6 is a quarret that adopts the question-answer strategy of Acta Martyrum and uses juridical language. What's most interesting about this is the question asked by Jerome if his native land does still exist. If we think that, in fact, he is no way isolated in the desert near Chalcis, every day he meets messenger, travelers, and postmen. His loneliness appears to be only a topos, only a mourn for being distant from the hot spot of Rome, to the extent that the very same question appears in Vita Pauli, linking definitively the two biographies. Episode 10 technically is not a narrative letter for me, but a text explaining the relationship between the epistolary and the lives. Here he dedicates his Vita Pauli and claims to have addressing rites with chosen words, classical epics, and colorful descriptions. Evangelical metaphors, the depiction of the contrast between East and West, the story about the monks of the desert spoiling its solitary life, and the element of the sea, again, are instead the content of episode 15-16 to Damasus, and prepare Jerome's coming to Rome, providing his profession fidei to the Pope, and his self-fashioning as an exegete. The end of Vita Pauli and the prologue of Vita Ilarione echoed these episodes. In all these letters of the first period, it tells us all about his life in the desert and his feelings. It's a diary, but it's fictional, rich in topic and intended for a vast public in Rome. It's a sense novel. The second period of his life and of his narrative letters opened in 385 in Rome. In the desperate moment when he was the object of hatred and impeachment, he felt he had to return to the tale, probably a few years before Vita Malchi. Violent sketches of secular Roman life opposed to the first female portraits and the Angulus theme here prevail, together with the narratological tool of flashback. For lack of time, I would refer you to my paper when it will be published on the Angulus theme from the conference in Rome, the Armenian conference in Rome. Lastly, the narrative episode of the third period, when Jerome settled in Bethlehem, are instead merely occasional and include very short stories, such as of Demetriades' choice, of Didymus the blind, and the beautiful Isarete bride, metaphor of the saint's relationship with the classics, or that of the mother and daughter in danger of backsliding to discredit Vigilantius. Eventually, Jerome's shift towards meta-narration. He wants to explain why he is telling stories and how he is working. And through the status of these letters, he tries to be ubiquitous in the ancient world. Finally, when he describes his journey through the desert and the Holy Land, he doesn't want to transmit a memorial travel diary, but to let poor people make the same journey, at least in a spiritual sense. Jerome author and audience now are extremely close. The same easy line between fictional and factual events marks the lives too. I have elsewhere discussed about some of the life sources. Here I desire to restate the ambivalence of their provenience. history and novel, introducing some new consideration on their narrativity and registering new findings. First, if Paul and Anthony are primarily Christian and religious characters due to their dependence from position to Evagrius Athanasius Vita Antoni, Marcus is definitely a pagan novelistic hero and Hilarion is a historical figure with exceptional traits. Poirsenec, Diosaner, Thaumaturge, and Wrestler, his biography shares features with those of Neoplatonic philosophers, Christ in the Gospels, and Jerome himself, as we know, but also with Alexander the Great. For example, to Curtius Rufus' historical work, Jerome owes a linguistic pattern for natural descriptions and an entire episode related to the death of the saint or emperor, in the case of Alexander. A woman who has been helped by him dies, overwhelmed by grief right after her champion. To greet Alexander's novel, a popular novelistic biography by Pseudo-Callisthenes, or maybe to its Latin translation by Julius Valerius, Vitellarione owes the strategies to resume the hero's life during the narration, the scene of the contention for his corpse, or even the chariot race. Last, to Plutarch's Life of Alexander, Hilarion's biography is in depth for some details. The product that diverts critiques, the hero's repulsion for Ludi, and the information that both Alexander and Hilarion had a favorite inseparable book, the Iliad for the first and his unwritten Gospel for the other. It is probable that the key to explain these similarities is the record of Alexander's exclamation in front of Achilles' tomb in Vita Hilarion's prologue. Here, for excess of exegetical zeal, the saint lists the variety of names used by Daniel for the Macedonian leader. Maybe this could betray Jerome's interest for historical works on Alexander to comment the prophet. All the more since we know that he was fond of historical writers. Ammianus Marcellinus, Aurelius Sextus Victor above all. Second, concerning Vita Malchi, I will only suggest a few reflections, since its narrativity has been already studied, being its dependence on ancient novel very explicit and productive. Even if Aguilar warns us that Jerome's knowledge of Greek literature was indirect and labile, except for exegetical works, I propose that he somehow read Heliodorus Aethiopica, maybe for the surmised Christian conversion of the author. In fact, many are the similarities with this work. The opening on a seascape, which signify not life as in the letters, but narration itself. The occurrence of linguistic puns and of different levels of narration, the tragic allure, the presence of shepherds, barbarian caves to hide in, and above all the behavior of Chariclea, a clever woman who elaborates a safety plan and a fake marriage, remaining chaste, exactly as the named heroine in Vita Malchi, and that of the Nemona's father, which resembled that of the abbot in Vita Malchi. At the end of this too quick survey on the narrativity of these works, we can see that the lives and letters share the aim to narrate and construct an ascetic model, its contents and its champions, using classical techniques and sources to fund Christian literature. Unusual scenarios versus real life, exemplar biographies versus choices and episodes, heroes versus heroines, structural presentation versus plots, saints versus the sinful Jeromes are only different aspects of a single literary paranetic operation intended to convince the public to the monastic cause. The collateral effect is that Jerome is introduced as a remarkable storyteller and a hero. For his addresses and for us, he is a friend whose incredible stories and challenges across exotic and queer lands are attractive to listen to. As he says in Vita Hilarionis, good enterprises need good storytellers, good as Homer, Ulysses, and Jerome. Thank you.